Hello everybody and welcome back to Spacedock. I'm Hojiwana and today we are returning to the topic of spacecraft sizes. Previously we covered why ships often change how big they are depending on context, but this video is more going to be a bit of a rant about how common it is in sci-fi for ships to just be absurdly huge. It doesn't happen all the time or in every franchise, but when it does happen, it happens a lot. One of the biggest offenders of this is Star Wars, where seemingly every new installment had to include something bigger and more badasser than anything that came before. Which is nuts because the series started out with a vessel that could be mistaken for an entire moon, and somehow going up in size from there was considered a good idea. There's a bit of a whiff of one-upmanship around these ships in particular that's just a bit childish. But not as childish as this sponsor spot from Raid Shadow Legends. Yes, that's right, Spacedock has finally fallen to the relentless forces of the advertisers, because Raid Call of the Arbiter is now running. What is that? A limited lore series with characters now appearing in-game, starting with Orc Warlord Artag, who anyone can get for free just by logging into the game for 7 days until July 24th. Still not convinced to play the game for all that crazy PvE and PvP content? Well, here's my top 3 reasons to play Raid Shadow Legends. Number 1, because this ad told you to. Number 2, if you like collecting stuff, the game has a ridiculous amount of stuff to collect. Look at that, 650 champions you can customize. Number 3, you can join or make a clan with your friends and take on bigger and badder bosses, or even other clans, while earning extra loot. Play Raid Shadow Legends now. Download it on PC, Mac, iOS or Android, and new players can use the big QR code that's been hanging around to get a free starter pack to get you going. Though if you're watching this video on mobile, then good luck with scamming it. Or just go click the link in the description below. Oversized ships aren't limited to that franchise though. They crop up all over the place, especially when the antagonist needs something large and powerful and scary. This is a fine goal in and of itself, as you can instantly indicate a difference in power and capabilities between two groups without needing to explicitly spell it out. Or perhaps show when something is otherworldly and more like a force of nature that couldn't possibly be dealt with through conventional means. But sometimes the resulting vessels are just completely overblown. What's even inside all these ginormous craft? How many people are crewing them? The first one of those I'll go over in a second, right after I've talked about aircraft carriers. These are the biggest real-world warships ever built, specifically the US Navy's supercarriers. The Enterprise, the Nimitz and Gerald R. Ford classes are well over 300 meters long and can displace over 100,000 tons when fully loaded, putting them far beyond even the largest battleships. They are truly enormous vessels because of the need to carry the 70, 80 or 90 aircraft that make up their air wing, as well as all the crew needed to maintain them. Oh, and the crew to run the ship, and all the other crew to look after everyone else, in multiple shifts every day. So just one of these vessels needs several thousand personnel on board in a ship only 300 meters long. Galactica is 3 times that size. Even the flight pods on it are bigger than a modern carrier. The Pillar of Autumn is wider than these carriers are long and has less people on board. The UNSC Infinity is 5 times the size of the Pillar of Autumn and has a population that just doesn't scale up with that whatsoever. It's nearly 6 kilometers long and can fit like 200 decks on it, but it only carries tens of thousands of people? And let's not even get started on what the Covenant uses. Another thing with ships this large, and the crew needed to run them, is the amount of supplies they would require to function. All the food, water and other things people need. You'd need to be resupplying these vessels non-stop, or they would need some expansive onboard food production. They'd be whole colonies in and of themselves, which is exactly why the Mega-class Star Destroyer gets a bit of a pass. It at least is meant to be a mobile country with its own industrial base and such, so it's not too crazy with how large it is. Another setting with huge ships that are a bit dumb is Warhammer 40k. In particular, there is one ship that just throws out huge numbers with no regard for how enormous they actually are. The Universe-class Mass Conveyor. These are 12-kilometer long trade ships with 60,000 person crews and space for up to 500,000 passengers, which seems a bit low, though to be fair this is a cargo ship and most of that space is going to go towards hauling a completely insane amount of material. You can lug around mountains in one of these. Yes, it's 40k and meant to be ridiculous, but come on. At least the setting has cargo ships being larger than most warships, which is a very common oversight in most sci-fi. Real industrial ships are big, much bigger than any warship has gotten. The largest cruise ships are bigger than supercarriers, container ships reach up to 400 meters in length, and tankers have gone well over that. There's even an enormous catamaran crane ship this big called the Pioneering Spirit, built to lift oil rigs and such around the North Sea. These vessels get this big because of economies of scale. It's just more efficient to transport as much as possible in one go. But huge ships can only really operate in safe waters. You wouldn't want to risk a vast amount of cargo like that if there was a chance of piracy. There's also an upper limit on certain dimensions like width imposed by canals, which have an easy sci-fi analogy in certain types of FTL gateway. There are other reasons for spacecraft to end up being very large, the first being propellant. Now yes, most settings ignore this as a thing entirely, but it's still worth bringing up. Depending on engine type and intended range, how much propellant a vessel carries can vary a whole lot. But if you're going for the more realistic end of things, then having your drive section being the majority of your craft makes a lot of sense. This doesn't just stop at engines either, as other ship systems ending up being big provides a reason for the ship itself to be big. Think of the dreadnoughts in Mass Effect or various unnecessarily ships, whose length is pretty much determined by the size of their main gun. You could try to make these weapons smaller, but to maintain the same effectiveness they need to use more energy per unit of volume, and that's a recipe for melting. There's a fine balance that needs to be found between systems being too small that they burn themselves out, and too big to be practical. A downside of having larger subsystems is what you wrap them up in, the hull and the armour. As per the square cube law, as you make an object bigger, its volume goes up much faster than its surface area does, which on first glance actually seems like a benefit for armour, as the amount of space inside it goes up faster than the amount of armour needed. But that ignores that armour itself is a 3D object. It is not an infinitesimally thin coating around everything else. It has volume of its own, and as that goes up, so does its mass. So while yes, you can fit more stuff inside a larger ship, the mass of the systems on the ship's interior and all the armour to go around it is going to be pretty hefty. I'll be talking more about armour next week, so subscribe for that one, but for now, if something has more mass, you need more thrust to move it at a reasonable speed. You also need more propellant to get around if your setting cares about that sort of thing. Oh yeah, and if you do end up specifying a mass for your creations, make sure they're in the right ballpark. You can check the density of various existing spacecraft, aircraft, tanks, submarines, battleships and such, and then apply that to your own so you don't end up with something made of polystyrene or neutronium. It's way easier to just not specify a mass of things. It doesn't matter that much. Related to the issue of lower thrust for these gigantic vessels is just how much more obvious they are, and how easy they would be to hit. While yes, it's more likely they'll be able to shrug off some damage due to built-in redundancy, those are still systems being destroyed and crew being killed. The plus side is that a relatively small ship is actually more likely to take critical damage from a bad hit because of how much more compact they are. But then that is also countered by just having more smaller ships. Either way, big or small, both have redundancy just in different ways. However, the Giga Turbo Dreadnought can only be in one place, and it represents a very large cost to deploy. All the crew need supplies and payment, if applicable. There's also the material cost of the ship itself, and the opportunity cost of it not being elsewhere. These are issues that more reasonably sized vessels just don't have because you can deploy them piecemeal, putting them where they're needed. Overall, I'm not saying all giant ships are bad, because they can make sense depending on context and story needs. For example, 40k has silly numbers because that's sort of the point. Galactica has to be large in order to seem like it can protect the civilian fleet, and then Pegasus has to be larger still to seem even more powerful than Galactica. But this doesn't always apply, and it's rare for oversized ships to have their downsides laid bare. So that's some food for thought for your own creations. You can make ships really big in your own setting, but consider if it's really necessary, or if oversized vessels really suit the story you're trying to tell. You can support Spacedock by joining our Patreon, where you can get our Spacefighter design reference book. Alternatively, you can support us directly through YouTube by giving us super thanks or by becoming a channel member. Thanks to our supporters, and thank you for watching.